Okay, welcome everybody. It's great to see a big show up for this event. It's a pleasure to welcome Michael Jacobides to this seminar. But first, let me start with the let's say the standard intro. Welcome to AI Horizons, and this is a webinar series presented at the Wharton Human AI Research, and this webinar series explores the frontiers of artificial intelligence through conversations with leading scholars and experts whose work is shaping our understanding of AI's ramifications on business and society. I'm Stefano Puntoni, and I'm Faculty Director of the Wharton Human AI Research. I'm also the Sebastian Kressley Professor of Marketing here at the Wharton School. It is a pleasure to welcome to this webinar Michael Jacobides, who is a Sir Donald Gordon Professor of Entrepreneurship and Innovation, and also Professor of Strategy at London Business School. He's also a lead advisor at Evolution and a visiting Professor of Management and Senior Fellow at the Mack Institute and visiting Professor here at the Wharton School. So we are looking forward to spending a few months hosting Michael. By the way, Michael is a graduate of Wharton, so it's great to have illustrious alumnus of the PhD program back in Philadelphia for some months. He's joining us today from London, though. And today our discussion will examine how generative AI is reshaping industries, business models, and competitive dynamics, and consider just how disruptive this technology may be in the years ahead. So what we are planning to do is to have Michael present some interesting findings from new research that is conducted, and so we'll let him explain what they did, but we'll basically reserve time for Q&A at the end of the webinar. Please use the Q&A functions to send us your questions, and we'll get to it later in the session. So Michael, I am going to leave the floor to you, and love to hear more about your answer to the question, how disruptive will generative AI be? I can't imagine of a more pressing question today than that one. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. And it's great to be with you. Apologies for the technical glitch and the fact that it's a little less fancy than it otherwise would have been. Goes to prove that sometimes focusing on technology alone will not solve your problems. Let me start, though, by speaking about technology and speaking about a very different approach to it. And I'd like to start by thinking about Gen AI, saying that Gen AI is a weird technology, historically speaking. Why is it weird? It's weird because usually technologies are funded in order to solve particular business problems. This was a technology funded by individuals who had a lot of money awaiting for the next wave and not terribly interested in what the monetization venues would be. Again, this is not something that is normal. And the amount of funding, which was driven by the rise of the GAFAM and the expectation that the new winners would become extremely valuable, certainly in terms of the asset prices, has led to the creation of things that, if you think about what they are product-wise, they're weird. They are the dreams of mostly geeks and mostly dudes who would say, yeah, man, if I could have the technology do all these things, it's going to be awesome for us. So think, for instance, about what Sam Altman presented when he started looking at the custom models. It's wonderful at the individual level, but how is this relevant for business? A little less evident. If we start looking at the evidence on what is it that we're using AI for, interestingly, the top use is therapy and companionship, followed by organizing your life, followed by finding purpose. Not exactly what you would call a oven-ready business solution. And if you look at broader data, this comes from an HBR that was providing a bit of a snapshot, but the broader data is that we still use it more outside work than for work itself. Therein lies the unusual bit of generative AI. It is something that we deeply believe is going to be very important, and we believe it's going to be very important because we can see it affect our lives on the daily. What that has led to is an absolute onslaught of organizations saying, oh my God, this is so important. Boards believe it, CEOs believe it, let's go find a use case. And of course, finding a use case is a very strange thing. And there has been a lot of self-proficiency noted of, hey, we can do lots of things with Gen AI. advisors will tell you that it's going to make you rich, rich, rich. Apologies to McKinsey, but there was a rather ridiculous, I think one of the most ridiculous reports that I saw that said $4.4 trillion in terms of profits. And you're like, forgive me, how on earth do you get to this number? And, the somewhat hesitant answer was like, well, to tell you what, we look at some productivity improvements, multiplied it by the number of countries, multiplied it by the number of sectors. It's a big number. Now, of course, these things are not going to be profits, but also, of course, it's normal for new technologies to go up in terms of the buzz and hype cycle. And if you look at Gartner's hype cycle, you would see that generative AI is in the absolute top. Here's where it becomes even more interesting. I think that if you start looking at the asset prices, there is a very good cause to start saying that we are entering a bubble in terms of asset prices. If you think, for instance, and the FT had a nice report on it, the investments that say NVIDIA is making to OpenAI, well, geez, if we invest 100 billion from you and we get 3.5 this amount of money, in terms of the chips that allows you to buy, this is money in the bank for us. And everyone's asset price are going up. And there is a concern that we're seeing a very similar phenomenon that we saw in the previous hype cycle, which was the hype cycle with the internet bubble, but with a much bigger number. Now, of course, you could say, okay, hype, hype, hype. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Jeff Bezos was saying recently that this AI boom is the good kind of bubble, because at the end of the day, it's not going to simply eliminate the value of asset prices. It's going to leave something behind. This is an interesting theory, but it's not entirely clear that this is fully supported by history, mostly because the problem is that hype can mobilize action, but also it can blur judgment. And this is a serious problem. And the problem that we have right now is that we need to have a bit more of a guide because we can relate to it. The technology is doing wonderful things. The tech advances very quickly. So I'm not saying that it's not going to have an impact. By God, it's going to have a major impact. And it is becoming quicker, cheaper, better, impressive, whichever way you cut it. But it needs to have other things that go with it. And if you want to take a historical precedent, if we look at previous periods in which technologies changed, think, for instance, about the growth of electrification. The growth of electrification took about 10 to 15 years before it started showing in productivity statistics. Why? Well, because people said, great, we can now have an electric rather than a big hydraulic steam motor. They did put them, though, in exactly the same configuration in the places of production. And the big advantage of the electric motors was that they allowed you to do new things. So you need to consider technology in context. We've also seen that in information technology. Some of the people that are looking at IT now, including at Wharton, draw on earlier work that basically tried to respond to the big puzzle that said productivity is everywhere other than computers are everywhere other than in productivity statistics. So if you think about what technology does, you need to understand what it is you need it for. Let me give you an example about that and think about what is the value of a doorman. Is the value of the doorman to open doors? And is technology going to eliminate doormen because we now have a technology to open doors? Not quite. The value of the doorman is to give you prestige, to give you security, to give you the possibility of grabbing a cab when it is raining outside, and to give you a sense that the exorbitant fees that you're paying in a building are worth it. And they're worth it in particular for the people owning the building. So when I see people saying, you can have consultancies that will entirely be eliminated because we can automate part of what they do, I think that they sometimes, even when they come from academic colleagues, may be disregarding part of what the actual value add is. Now, mind you, that doesn't mean that AI will not entirely change that. And in particular, going to the same publication where I wrote recently, in particular, if you think about professional services, I think that it's going to totally change the way that we do. Why? Because some of the basic stuff is going to go away, but that's always happened in a big number of professions and types of jobs. But that may have some interesting implications in the changes of the model. We all know that we need fewer juniors. As such, the pyramid is changing. Also, the mix between capital and labor may mean that partnerships with their traditional structures are no longer relevant. So what we need is to think about how Gen AI reshapes the existing value propositions. And it's important to think about the context, because for analysis that focus too much on technology, they totally miss the point. Let me give you one of the most classical examples. The person who is known as the godfather of AI, Geoffrey Hinton, made this stark prediction in a very much discussed meeting of the Radiologists Association, where he said that people should stop training radiologists now. It is completely obvious that in 5 years, deep learning is going to be better than radiologists. He said that in 2016. He was right. If you think about the Turing test, it is the case that machines were on average better than radiologists in most of them. But the question is, what happened to the employment of radiologists? If you go and Google it, you will see across different geographies, we are speaking about the crisis of radiologists. But the interesting thing is that the crisis of radiologists is that there is much greater demand than there is supply. We are entering a period where radiologists are increasing the prices and we just can't train enough of them. Why? Well, because Hinton was looking at one narrow problem, the possibility of technology substituting the human judgment. He didn't see that there needs to be a complementarity between what they do and a much greater expansion in the remit, the scope, and the potential areas of value add of radiologists, which increased their demand and made them an even greater shortage. So with this as background, let me share a few words of guide from research that we've undertaken, primarily from a project that I did with the Institute of Directors and one of the large private equity companies, and supported by Evolution Limited. Some other stuff that I'll mention also connects the work that I had done in the Henson Institute in BCG, where I'm an academic advisor. But let's go straight to what is it that we see when we try to see, well, what is it that gives us a sense of the impact of AI? First of all, let me start with the evidence that we have. And the evidence that we have is still coarse, but what we asked is people to tell us whether they saw that there was a significant, moderate, or not really important impact of Gen AI when it is systematically used in the workplace. And we wanted to tease out first from their assessment of what has happened so far, what are the impacts and how the use of Gen AI affects whether it has a real impact on the workplace. And the second, it is what is the expectations for disruption. Let me start with the data first. If you think about the data, we looked at things like how broad was it, or how deep was the possibility of AI having an impact. And you look at the number of use cases, and conditional on having a use case, 14 was the max categories that we came up with, whether it was used ad hoc or more systematically. Unsurprisingly, the more excited you are, the more you use it, and the more you use it, the more excited you become. We can't disentangle causation. Now, what is more interesting is that what you see, especially when you move from moderate to I'm really excited about Gen AI, you see that there is a much greater emphasis on the increase in how systematic you are. And when you start unpeeling it, you see that those that use it systematically in areas closer to the core of the organization are those that realize the benefits. Writing emails, summarizing documents, yawn, yawn. Useful, possibly, helps, possibly. Interestingly, is not able to distinguish between the different types of organizations and how they work out. Once you start going to operations, though, or to IT and engineering, or even risk and legal, you start seeing some real impact. And that tells you that you need to get closer to the heart of the organization itself. The other thing that we saw was there was a very interesting rhyme and reason in terms of what is able to describe what you'd use it for. So those who use it for cutting costs in the usual way are not able to distinguish in particular organizations that show being more or less excited with the use of Gen AI. It was hyper-personalization and step change in customer engagement and the creation of new business models that led to the excitement. you can also start saying, oh, well, if it isn't about technology, what are the things that complement technology? And if you look at what complements technology, you understand that in different sectors, there's different stuff. There's some sectors where you're like, in writing code, fairly straightforward to see what the impact is. And my effort is going to see how does that affect competitive advantage. In other areas, like healthcare or education, it is much more about being able to change the things that will allow you to make things make a difference. So if you put this together, what does it mean in terms of the patterns that we have already seen before I start moving in disruption and the future? It means that Gen AI is useful because it allows you to interrogate data. It allows you to figure out patterns. But what you need to do is that you need to think in its context. What do we mean its context? Operational, organizational, strategic context. Let me start, first of all, with the operational and the data context. It means that in addition to interrogating the data, you need to think about data engineering. You need to think about having the data that allow you to get to insight. But even more important, it is the fact that you need to, once you get the insight, embed it and ensure that you can do something with it. And this is not to be taken for granted. The idea of A/B testing, which is what distinguishes many of the big tech firms and firms that are leveraging AI to see, let me see how it plays out. Let me then collect further data. Let me cement my advantage because I am creating the positive dynamics. And then you also need to think about the value of things like proprietary data, which is rightly becoming a big area of focus. But in addition to that, I would add the knowledge base that is created through engaging in a particular domain. Because we're now shifting from the technology to the moats that are enabled or destroyed by technology that is then going to run on creating new business models, changing customer engagement, or affecting the cost or productivity that may ultimately emerge. Then we said, okay, let's think about disruption, because I told you about impact. What about the future? Well, in terms of disruption, what our research of there were about 160 interviews in addition to about 300 odd very detailed surveys allowed us to start unpeeling what exactly we mean by disruption. And disruption means three different things. The first thing is that AI can lead to displacement. What does that mean? It means that the entire area is pushed away. So, Stefano, I'm sorry to be so brutal in terms of marketing, but unfortunately, there are good parts of the marketing profession that are rightly, seriously concerned about the fact that they're being entirely pushed aside. SEO, DEO can be done better by a machine. That's easier to displace than some of the consulting stuff. So there is a concern of, hey, will I be able to continue justifying it? In addition to that, there's two more things, only partly overlapping. One of them is the fact that you now have new factors that are driving what's going to make you successful or not. And that's the classic disruption. And there are many people who are focusing on what it is that allows them to find new ways of becoming more effective. And we're starting to find the rhyme and the reason of what lies behind these three distinct but often collinear, i.e., co-evolving forces. Because we see many settings where proprietary data are important, settings where pattern recognition are important, where people say it's going to be a bloodbath, but some of us are going to leverage that in order to drive competitive advantage, and the factors that make you successful or unsuccessful are starting to change. So what do we expect in terms of disruption? A very uneven picture, mediated by regulation, mediated by liability, mediated by modularity, more if we have time in a future setting, and also one where we expect many things to change. Things that will affect what organizations do in terms of the who, the what, and the why. Think about business school like ours, Stefano. If you think about what we do, the first thing is, well, the how, both we admit people, we evaluate people, we teach people, is being transformed because of Gen AI. How do you think about the essays that people write in order to gain acceptance to or be evaluated by way of results? And how do you think about the integration of these technologies as someone who engages in teaching? But more deeply, what is it that we now need to focus on offering to those who come in a business school and expect to be able to complement what is out there in terms of Gen AI with the complements that are going to make them more effective in the marketplace? And more fundamentally, why are we there to begin with? And I think that this makes us think that there is both an important area in terms of sorting out what makes sense and what doesn't. The focus of the network and the possibility of directing people and capital, and I expect to see a greater stratification. But it asks significant questions in terms of organizations. Finally, I spoke about the operational stuff. I spoke about the strategic stuff. Let me end with the organizational stuff. And what we also see is that there is rhyme and reason. I'm drawing on another related recent research that I'm doing with my colleagues in Evolution Limited, working with companies trying to implement them, is that if you think about what works when you look at organizations that try to put AI in action, is a portfolio that combines evolution and revolution. What do I mean? I mean that there are different ways in which you can approach it. One way that you approach it is a traditional left to right thinking, i.e. thinking about how you will carefully consider how your organization is structured and embed AI. And the other is to rethink the structure. What do I mean? Well, I mean that when you start looking at the use of IT in organization, there is a significant amount of failure because first, I think there is a great underappreciation of one major factor, which is fear. People respond to Gen AI as something that is fundamentally antithetical to their possibility of adding value. And managing their fear can be something that is important. How do you do that? Well, by iterative co-creating with domain experts. For two reasons. First, resistance to fear. Start by telling people what is it that is the greatest annoyance, and then start building on the basis of this. And then people will all of a sudden be more excited. And the second is that the technology itself scarcely is able to connect with the operational reality. And we have seen that the iterative co-creation with domain experts makes a difference. The second is embedding AI in existing knowledge flows and also in existing incentive structures that make people want to engage and support AI, as opposed to thinking about it as quite often is driven overtly or not as something that will reduce only the FTE in a particular business. And the final thing is that in order to be good at AI, especially because it moves so fast and there is such a great variety of solutions, it requires you to be more open and interconnected than you were before. Organizations like simple request for proposal, like having one or two vendors, like having a simplicity, which unfortunately, given the fluidity of the environment, ends up not working out so well. And the big mega solutions rarely produce the results that we would want them to. For this evolution, you also need to start thinking about whether you need to change your organization. Hermine Ibarra and I just had an article in HBR thinking about how leaders, even in more traditional businesses, need to rethink what their skills are in a world of AI. But some of the choices are not just individual and leadership choices, where I think that they are quite important and impactful. They also are structural. And the structural that I see, one example that I have here is Athina Kanyura, the Chief Operating Officer, the Chief Strategy and Transformation Officer of PepsiCo, is that you see organizations that are combining strategy, transformation, and technology. Because otherwise, the silos and the inevitable politics in large organizations that exist there mean that it is ineffective, and the existing divisionalization might not necessarily be as effective as we would like it to be. And you see a lack of potential imagination for what you can do given that AI changes the fabric of your organization. Let me give you an example. I was in a meeting, I was working with SAP. One of the big customers, Heineken, was presenting to some of their other senior clients saying, oh, look at what we have. And now they have announced that it's a program called Happy or Hoppy or something of that sort. And then they said, and what we can do is to have the full information with verified information internally and verified externally. You really can know everything about beer. And I was like, great. So what do you do with that? And, they stood back and said, well, hang on a minute. This is really the wet dream of an IT professional of the 90s, and it's all wonderful, isn't it? The real question is not only whether that is a good information management tool, but what do you do to the organization? If now you have broken the silos and you have such information at the fingertip, why do you not use it to change how entrepreneurial the organization is and rethink the career, both scope and obligations, and the possibility of coming up with new ideas on the basis of information that does not need to go up and down the chain? And organizations such as NVIDIA are doing that, I think, big time. In terms of new ventures, and I'm sorry, I'm cognitively bounded, so I'll use one of which I'm in the advisory board on and one of them in the board of directors. What I see is organizations that are starting to rethink the entire process. So Evolver, for instance, has been put by a bunch of senior people, primarily EY, the former CTO, former head of AI, who saw the writing on the wall, and they said professional services are not going to be able to respond well to that. What we need to do is to take information and rewire it, a little bit like what Palantir is doing for other lines of business. And they said, let's not accept either the existing IT infrastructure or the existing ways in which we think about the information problem, but start with information flows and structure services and monetization around it. Or what we saw in Aegis, and that was put together by some of the people that was working in the IOD, saying, blimey, that might be changing traditional sectors. So basically, they looked at cybersecurity and they realized that you are able to use AI to reduce the costs and response times, but around 80%. So currently they're sort of developing that because there's a massive amount of additional cybersecurity requirements that could be done at a fraction of the cost. How is that done? It is done by totally rethinking not left to right, but right to left, where you want to go and what the structures, the underlying structures are. But whether it's right to left or left to right, I think that what you need to do is not expect that technology is going to solve it. You need to understand the strategic context, you need to understand the organizational context, and you need to be much more thoughtful about not only the detail, but the big picture. And in a time that we are tired of listening to trite comments from politicians, let me offer some comments of a previous US president that is slightly more inspiring. I don't want to say any more to jeopardize my next entry to the United States, which is to keep your eyes on the stars and the feet on the ground. And hopefully, part of the research and part of the work that we're doing both here and in Wharton and the efforts that you're leading will start putting us that way. So that was by way of general background, and I look forward to any questions from you or indeed from the audience.
Great, thank you, Michael. Very interesting, and congratulations for all the work that you've done over the last couple of years to try to understand the strategic implications of generative AI for organization. I think there are a lot of interesting questions, and I think some of the early work that you've been doing, including the new HBR, which I'm looking forward to reading. I didn't know actually about it, so great to see that. Now, to the attendees, I'd love to see your questions. We have a few. I will start addressing these. I see a couple of questions about availability of the materials. Yes, we are recording and we will post later. Okay, so Michael, just one thing. You made this point at the beginning about the distinction between using Gen AI to reduce costs, basically a productivity tool, versus using Gen AI to come up with new products or new business models and basically generate revenues. I'm completely in agreement with you, and obviously as a marketing professor, I see the potential of Gen AI to create new spaces for business to provide value to customers as being essentially the more transformational view of Gen AI. You were making that analogy with electricity. I think there's a very nice analogy there, in that basically, it's going to take time. It's going to need us to reinvent and reimagine entire industries or product categories. And so just with that in mind, a couple of questions for you. First one, why do you think the focus of the conversation around Gen AI and leaders is so focused on cost and productivity? Oftentimes with this vibe around headcount and of course threatening to a lot of employees. What do you think that makes it so? And second, based on your discussion with all these directors that you met in all these roundtables and work groups, what is your sense for what kind of spaces or what kind of customer benefits? How do we think about AI in terms of inventing new opportunities for business. So more the revenue boosting. Where is that revenue boosting going to come from? Is it going to be personalization? Is it going to be entirely new products and services? Is it going to be about new modes of interactions? I'm curious to hear your admittedly speculative take at this point. Would love to hear what you think.
Well, let me start from the first one. I just returned from a weekend with one of the most effectively run telcos in Europe, and I remember having a dinner with the CFO, and he was like, "Well, look, if you look at our results, you will see that we are very progressive, but we are down to earth." And we want to see the results. We're not going to be investing simply for investing. And I think that there is a variety. There are some organizations that are happy to take the plunge and expect that they will see the benefit. And there are others that want to run themselves a little bit more conservatively. I think that right now we have the worst of both worlds. There is panic buying for nothing, i.e. organizations feel pressured often from the boards that often have a very, shall we call it, vague understanding of what AI does, that then put pressure to the senior leadership. And then even when the senior leadership likes it, it lands with a, so what are we supposed to be doing with it? Although that is evolving. The problem is that FTE reduction is a very easy metric, and it's one that easy to comprehend. My sense is that we're still at a stage where many organizations are looking at it one project at a time. And I don't think that that's where you can think about where the benefits are. I mean, I was using the example of Evolve earlier on, and I think that one of the things that they've found and been looking at the data that has been generated is that if you look at the process by process cost saving is smaller than the you cut through processes that exist throughout the organization. In a way, AI allows you to benefit if you are able to go beyond what does this technology do within this function, and then saying, okay, we have some major reporting to do, or we have some functions that are supporting things. So I think that even in cost cutting, there is an excessive compartmentalization, and that means that you don't end up cutting as much. And that's sort of item number one. The second thing is that, again, people think about automation, and although they like to speak the big speech, they're like, yeah, but basically that just reduces the costs. And it is a little harder because when it comes to revenue generation, you require often to do things that are going to be both more disruptive and more interdisciplinary, and that require you to rethink. I think they are not as friendly to the existing decision-making organization, which is why I was saying that there is evolution and revolution happening at the same time. Here's an interesting thing. I see evolution, and the thoughtful evolution is the one that says, okay, let's avoid the usual mistakes and, possibly think about how we can create some upside, but in a more structured and thoughtful way. And in the same organizations, you see pockets of revolution where, when it's a new product or a new geography, where people start with constrained budgets, starving organizations selectively is not necessarily a bad thing. Using AI selectively with asset salvation, saying, hey, if you want something new, develop it, and you don't have to fend off the problems that you see usually in organizations, right? So I think that there you also see why the creation of new revenues is easier, because it does not go back to the body politic. So I think that the answer is it's easy to not think about strategy and to focus on cost, because it's organizationally, behaviorally, the simple thing to do, does not really affect the existing politics. You can find some owners, get it off your chest as I had to do something, and then the organization can continue on. However, what I think is really interesting is that this may affect the positioning and the competitive dynamics. So, let me give you sort of an example. One of the companies, or a private equity company that we looked at, Arco Educação, a tech company that is based in Brazil, used it in order to cement its position by having the teachers that would be uploading teaching plans and have things that are going to be able to have a bigger reach. Now, this is interesting because all of a sudden you're like, ooh, if I then become an edutech that has Gen AI created and updated plans that are easy to upload and rethink what the exams are, I can start having something which increases my ability of creating a bottleneck. So you start thinking about the strategic stuff. But again, I think that this is a function of how the organizations are going about it. And I think that I'm absolutely comfortable with leadership teams like the leadership type team I just worked with that says, hey, we want to be reasonable and not just buy a dream, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be focusing only on a case-by-case FTE reduction. In my experience, that ends up underplaying what the organization can do. And some of the bigger questions, I think that, you need to use it as an opportunity to rethink how you do business. And I have seen it used in a much more energizing rather than demoralizing way. And that's in our purview.
Yeah, I think to a large extent it's a failure of imagination, and as such it's a failure of leadership too.
Yeah.
Now we have about 12 minutes left, so we have a lot of questions. I'm going to pick a little bit and try to wave some of that, and hopefully that will be interesting to our participants. Now, you were making this point, Michael, just now about, and by the way, we'll try to rotate through these questions fairly quickly, so let's try to move on every 2-3 minutes so that we can go through a few. But you were making this point about the fact that, if you don't have baggage, basically if you don't have legacy, you're able to confront the technology in its environment and make something of it in a way that might be very difficult for a more established firm. That in turn seems to suggest that for new entrants, this is a great opportunity, that there might be a way of creating markets or unseat a bit more in like the, innovator's dilemma type situation, where basically new companies might seize opportunities here that larger, more established companies struggle to seize. I see a question here from Sat, who says, what differences do you see in the way small businesses, medium-sized and large enterprises use AI? Is there any nuances in the speed of adoption?
Okay, so two things. First of all, at the very high level, I think that what is happening, and there's a broader pattern, and with my my former colleague and your current colleague, John Paul McDuffie, we've been working at sectors from starting with automotive to show how innovation is not a question of either or, but it is of ecosystems of codependence of the existing incumbents. Only Tesla is a true new entrant, and everyone else relies on a web of relationships where the existing firms with the hard assets work with the smaller firms. I expect this pattern to continue, and I expect that there's going to be, unfortunately, dominance of a few firms that will not have such rapid rotations. Some of the market valuations are silly, but there's going to be, if you think about the production, some of the existing firms will find better ways of working with small organizations. And small organizations are working to complement the existing ones as opposed to wholesale displace them. So do I expect wholesale displacement? No. Do I expect a change in the pecking order? Yes. The other thing that I think that we're going to see is that there's going to see a change in the distribution of stability. We saw that in the previous AI wave. I expect that we're going to see that now. Now, in terms of patterns, yes, there are a few things that tend to be different because the propensities, the advantages and the disadvantages of different organizations differ. And it is a function of size and a function of what they do. We're doing now another project with my hat on with the Henson Institute looking at knowledge management. And what we're coming to understand is that there is something that essentially biologists called exaptation, pre-adaptation. There are some companies, not because they're very clever, that end up being well suited to take advantage of Gen AI, and some that are not. And it is partly a function of size and also partly a function of their information readiness, their ability to change. So what we will expect to see is some changes, and that's the current work that we're looking at, of seeing descriptively what is it that makes some firms better and sometimes work, and prescriptively, what can you do to help organizations be better able to adapt to this new technology. But that will take us to another webinar, hopefully in a few months from now.
Okay, great. Let me, maybe a couple of things that I like to cover. I see a question here on human capital. I always make the spiel that basically Gen AI deployment is more in a way, or at least as much a human capital challenge than it is a tech challenge. For the reasons that I think you articulated also. Now, FIDA here has a question about that, or the talent pipeline, saying, current juniors or future seniors, will AI break the talent pipeline or allow instead AI fluent graduates to enter the workforce at a higher level than an intern or a specialist. What do you think Gen AI is going to do to the talent pipeline?
This is a very serious problem. And I think that part of the problem is that organizations know that they may be undermining themselves, but they can't help it, i.e. that this is an externality, that you're like, what am I doing in terms of the ability of using the talent? A moment ago, I was speaking about what's happening to the pyramid. I remember when I used to live in New York, my friends in Scadden Arps would sleep 4 hours a day and would stay in their offices because that's what it took to become a partner there. Now, if you start thinking that the pyramid from this way becomes that way, you can no longer be as violent to your juniors. And what does that mean for the way that you recruit, that you promote, and for the entire model? This is something that a number of organizations will need to think about because it goes beyond the talent management. It goes to the business structure. It goes to the career evolution, to what is it that I expect I'm going to get out of it, and as such, what do I put in the business? It changes the potential deal. It changes the way that I, entering the ladder, think about my potential progression, and as such, what I'm willing to give to the organization. So I think that these are important questions, and you need to locally adapt to that. But some of it is that, well, I was speaking to managing partners at the law firm saying, well, we'll start to think about hiring laterally, and about thinking about developing talent in a different way. So this is where it's really cool, because what starts as an AI issue is hugely strategic and organizationally important, not as a technological issue, but as an organizational issue. And these things will be with us very soon.
Yeah, and I think many organizations have not thought through what basically AI means for the talent strategy and for how we're going to, in the end, competitive advantage is going to lie ultimately in the talent of the people and that the organizations have. Let me ask another question that is more about deployment, and I hear this question a lot when I talk to executives. This is a question from Shilaya, who says, Gen AI is evolving very fast. The tech infrastructure has not yet caught up. When and how should an organization think about right to left changes for tech that is going to rapidly change over the next 2 to 5 years, given the FOMO and pressure to adopt AI? Basically, what do? The technology is on a massive trajectory. We cannot not do anything, but on the other hand, this is still very uncertain and rapidly evolving. What are leaders to do?
Well, I think that it's an interesting question, but the direction in which the technology is changing is oddly much more predictable than it was in many other technological eras in the past. Essentially, what we have is something which is very architecturally boring. Sure, it is very impressive because it moves ever sort of more broadly. But if you think about it as a pure technological issue, what this technology is able to do is in a predetermined path, because the types of problems that are being solved are not terribly new. So the direction of travel is given. When we will stall in terms of the speed, that we do not know. The modality of it is less of a technological question and more of a user interface question, which has to do with the strategies of the big technology players and whether the devices are going to change and whether, for instance, OpenAI and the others will be able to be successful in their efforts of vertically integrating into device and then capturing attention, then driving attention, further pushing people in marketing, trying to figure out what exactly their role is if they do all the information discovery. So I think that there are areas where you say, well, I don't quite know what it is, let me sit on it. But I think there are many areas where what you can do is you can start changing. The way that I look at it, the way that I've looked at it when I've worked with leadership teams, is that I would say, first, there is a set of actions, which is no regret bets, 6 to 12 months. And these are things that you can do because things have changed. Your organization will need to confront not only the AI, but the complements of the technology. And then you can have a few things that are conditional bets, and you can figure out what's going to happen. But usually the basics of change management don't need to wait for the full technology to be ready. It never is going to be ready. It will always be evolving. But I think that most of the changes that need to happen can happen.
Okay, so if you think change, in a way, I think your question is it's a steep line, but it's perhaps somewhat predictable, somewhat at least, and we should take steps under certain scenarios. There's here an anonymous question, which I thought interesting in regard to that issue then, and the question is, who in the organization should be working on reimagining the organization on AI with AI? Whose shoulders should be landing? Who should be leading with imagination? Should it be the strategy team? Someone with an AI background? What do you think? In your experience, when you talk to people, who seems to have the best idea?
I think that this is a really interesting question. Speaking with a team from inside Partners that's trying to figure that out for many of their tech investments, and part of the question is: will the people from the technology world, will the CIOs or CTOs of this world, be able to become change managers and understand the strategy enough to drive change? Possibly. I think it's going to be a heterogeneity, and it has to do with what are the predispositions and the things that make them happy in life, especially when you spent, 20, 30 years of your life arriving to a particular area. I think that my expectation is that you're going to see a greater confluence in terms of combination, which is why I use the Finakanyura's example, and the confluence of change management, of strategy, and of technology. I think that there needs to be a sense strategically of what the bets are and how the bets are changing in the organization. I think that you need to be also, by the way, very specific. One of the problems that you're going to have is you're going to have tons of vendors saying, oh, we have solutions. The problem must be well defined. The metrics must be well defined. And you have to have, the long range knowledge, but also the ability of managing the project. So you do need some people leading it, and then you need some discipline in executing. And I think that whether that's going to come from strategy meets project management and change management, or from technology is an open question. It may be that part of the technology development skills at the senior level are not quite as easy to translate. But this is where there's going to be some interesting pains within the organization. And I think that, again, we're coming back to the organizational nub of the strategic transformation to make technology really productive.
Thank you, Michael, and I agree with you. And I think organizations are struggling. So some are introducing a CAI role, which is meant to be something compared to the CTO. So I think it's interesting to see how organizations are going to set themselves up for success in this area. Now, there were many other interesting questions, about 20, in fact, including questions about work slop, the quality of Gen AI work.
One of my favorites.
Also a question of agentic AI. Would have loved to get into that too. Unfortunately, we are out of time. We are on the dot, so we're going to wrap it up here. I'm going to thank you all for attending in such large numbers. It's great to see such a big audience showing up for this topic. Michael, thank you for being here with us today and for sharing your interesting work at the boundary of strategy and technology. And we're looking forward to having you around the Wharton School in the coming months. Thank you all again, and please attend our upcoming AI Horizons meetings.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. It'll be a pleasure I'll try to see whether I can answer any of the questions that have been gathered by email. Feel free to reach out to me as well. Easy to Google or connect on LinkedIn for any further questions. Thank you very much for hosting, and I look forward to engaging some more back with